For I'm Rachel Burnett. I'm a committee secretary of CCS, and I'm standing in for Chris Rees, our chairman, who is at this very minute as I speak on his way to Rome to speak at a conference, so he can't be here. Our talk this afternoon is about Silicon Valley's forgotten female microcomputer pioneers, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Gareth Edwards. Gareth's a writer and historian who focuses on exploring the gaps in common historical narratives. He has particular interests in and expertise in transport, technology, and military history. And he's a respected digital strategist in both the UK and the United States. Now, if you've got any questions, please would you save them till the end of the talk if you're in our live audience. And if you're in our live Zoom, please would you put the questions on chat and we'll pick them up at the end of the talk. Thank you. Gareth?
So firstly, can everyone in the room hear me if I speak roughly at that level? Is that all good? Okay. Secondly, I'm now going to play which screen is this on in the background, just so I can show you in the room. Get rid of the giant OK bar in the top corner. There we go. I think we're good. The iPad things will work out, no doubt. So, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. So I will just crack on. So we're here today to talk about Vector Graphic. Vector Graphic were one of the pioneering companies in Silicon Valley in the peak of the microcomputer era, the birth of home computing. And our story for this actually starts here in London. It starts less than a mile from where we're standing right now. It starts in a hotel conference room, or rather as it was then, a ballroom that had been converted. And it starts in 1981. And it starts with a group of investors gathered because there's a hot new IPO, a share issuing coming out of Silicon Valley. And the underwriters for that and the staff and CEO for that company are on a worldwide tour to promote this share offering. And there's a lot of interest in this, and there's your kind of standard people in suits waiting to invest, and they're gathered in this room to hear the CEO speak. And while they're waiting, as with here today, there's a coffee table outside. And so one of these senior investors wants a coffee. So he looks around and he sees next to obviously the coffee is a very disinterested looking woman. So he goes over to the woman and he says, "Would you mind pouring me a coffee?" She gives him a look, then pours him a coffee. About 5 minutes later, the underwriters walk onto the stage like I am here now, and they say, "We're grateful that you could all join us here today. We would now like the CEO of Vector Graphic to come to the front and talk about why you should invest in Vector Graphic." And the woman who was standing next to the table brushes her short brown hair aside and walks up and stands up in front of the entire crowd that's assembled. She scans the room. She pins with her eyes the investor that she saw earlier. And she says, "My name is Lore Harp, CEO and founder of Vector Graphic." And her accent is a mix of Californian and German, which makes it really stand out in the room. And she finds the man that she'd spoken to earlier and she locks eyes with him and she says, "Sir, do you need me to get you another cup of coffee?" And the room goes quiet. And then she says, "Good. We got out of the way." And then she begins to speak and talk to them about her firm. The two people we are here talking to about today and about their firm is these two people that you will have on your screen now, Lore Harp and Carole Ely. Vector is founded in 1976. It was founded in the back bedroom of Lore Harp's family home. Within a year, it is a multi-million-dollar business influencing an enormous number of the founders and people that we know of in Silicon Valley and that we talk of today. Lore Harp in particular will run that firm for almost 10 years before she walks away from it entirely. And it succeeded, and she succeeded, despite the enormous atmosphere of sexism and everything else that was present in that time. And yet their stories today are mostly forgotten. And one of the things I want to explore today is some of the influences that are involved in that, what their story is, and actually why they have dropped out of the narrative. So this story really starts slightly earlier than that. It starts with this chap. This chap is called Ed Roberts. Ed Roberts is really, arguably, the founder of modern home computing, microcomputing as we know it. Ed is born in 1941. He grew up in a relatively low income family and he always wanted to be a doctor. But because he was from a low income family, being a doctor wasn't something he could afford to do easily. So Ed went to university on the US Air Force's dollar. They paid for him to go to university. But of course, they weren't going to pay for him to go to university to be a doctor. What they really, really wanted at that time was electrical engineers. So Ed went to university and became an electrical engineer. He founded, when he left the Air Force, he founded a company called MITS, which stood for Micro Instrument and Telemetry Systems. They started by making basically very rudimentary electronics to power model rockets. He moved from that over time into making calculators. So electronic calculators, as that was a big thing at the time. To do that, he used chips made by Texas Instruments, one of the big firms that were around at the time. Calculators became an enormous industry in the US and the world, absolute money-making industry and a half. You wouldn't think it today, but they were huge at the time. Texas Instruments very quickly realized that rather than selling their chips to other people to make calculators, what they should actually do is make calculators themselves. So they entered the market and instantly undercut everyone entirely, forcing a whole bunch of people out of business and others to think about what they might do. One of those people was Ed Roberts. Faced with going effectively bankrupt because calculators were now not making money, Ed did a bit of what we call today a YOLO. He turned around and decided he was going to make the very first actual affordable home computer that people could buy, hobbyists could buy and tinker with at home. He got a $65,000 loan from the bank, and that was mostly given to him because he already owed the bank about $250,000 in 1974 money, which is a lot of money. And so they figured, what's more money after that? We might as well, in case we might get some back. And he made an affordable microcomputer. This quote I've got up on the screen now is a thing that I think is really important because there's the story of Ed Roberts is a story in its own right. But I think what gets forgotten sometimes is he was fascinated with computers because he saw them as a democratizing thing. He was eternally fascinated with them, and this quote, as it says, to some extent, your worth has always been measured by the number of people you control, the number of people you own. So by any historical definition, if you have a computer, you're wealthy. I mean, wealthy beyond all imagination. That's always intrigued me about computers, the enormous amount of power it gives us regular folk. And I think that's a trend in thinking that we actually see carry on through computing. But I always find it fascinating that right back in 1974, that's one of the things that's driving Ed Roberts forward. The computer that he creates is this one. You see it on the front there of Popular Electronics, although actually you don't see it on the front of Popular Electronics because the one that was sent to Popular Electronics to appear on the front cover was lost because the firm that was carrying it to New York at the time for the photo shoot went bust. And it disappeared into the US Postal Service and never emerged. What you're actually seeing on the cover there is a case with nothing in it that Ed Roberts frantically sent them afterwards. But anyway, this was released in December 1974. It ran an Intel 8080 processor. It had up to 4K of RAM. I mean, that's huge amounts of RAM. Most importantly, all it had what's called an S100 bus. This was effectively to allow things to be plugged into it. So if you wanted to plug extra circuit boards and things in, you could. This in itself was revolutionary because he could have made it a machine that you couldn't upgrade. They didn't. They made it a machine that you could upgrade. And it retailed at about $450. Now that's roughly about $3,000 today. So I always find it quite fascinating that computers like this all the way through have really kind of kept the same price in a way that they still get now. If you were buying a high-end machine today, you'd be paying roughly that amount. So in a weird way, although we think things have got cheaper, they've actually almost kept up with the pace of inflation. So Ed Roberts is primarily responsible along with a guy called Bill Yates, who was his lead engineer. And the key thing that this does is it absolutely turns the world upside down for anyone who is vaguely interested in electronics. Because up until now, if you wanted to use a computer, you've got to be at a university. You're into a room the size of this. You're into gatekeepers, people who would take punch cards off of you, then they would go and run them on the machine and come back and give you some paper and go, that was your program. You go, that's quite nice, but I would have quite liked to see everything moving in the lights. And so what this does is it causes something that gets called the Altair effect, which is it inspires a generation of people to start getting involved in computing at home as hobbyists. Now, something that's worth mentioning is that most of these Altairs aren't coming assembled. If you buy an Altair, what you're getting is a box of parts and a set of instructions that says this is how you assemble them. And you're probably going to get a chunk of those instructions wrong and have to write back to MITS and say, I've absolutely managed to completely ruin this board. Can you send me another one? In which case MITS will say, yes, we can in 4 months' time, and it's going to cost you another $200. But it worked. Various people are inspired by this. If you ever made a proper film about this, it would be like the Avengers Assemble when you come at something called the Homebrew Computer Club, which was in Southern California at the time. You have everyone there. That's where Steve Wozniak is, Steve Jobs, people we'll encounter later, Adam Osborne, Lee Felsenstein, a guy called Roger Mellon's there. All these people are people who will create this industry. And actually, weirdly, they all happen to be there in that one room almost at the time. And they have an Altair on the table in front of them, and it changes their world. Steve Wozniak says that that was the moment he knew he could build the computers that were in his head, because he could see them there and he could go, I can build these things. Now, one person who isn't in the room, but who's inspired by them, is Dr. Portia Isaacson. That's a name that some people might not recognize in this room. Dr. Portia Isaacson is a US Air Force officer at the time as well. She is massively inspired by the Altair when she finds out about it. She goes off and founds one of the first computer retail companies in the US. It's based out of Texas at the time. It's in Dallas, Texas. And she goes on to create, I forget what they're called, one of the big early computing consulting firms. She is the person that gives a guy called Rod Canyon, a young engineer called Rod Canyon, a lift. He gives her a lift to the airport when he's working at Texas Instruments, and she advises him on how to set up a business, and she offers to introduce him to some people who have some money. Rod Canyon goes on to found Compaq. So if Portia had not got really interested in Altairs, you wouldn't have all the kind of Compaq PCs and HP computers you see in computers today. And this is what I mean about how this is a nexus. All of these people are there and doing these things in interesting ways. Chuck Peddle on there is a guy who'll be familiar to people who know chips. He goes on to work at Commodore, creates all the brilliant chips that end up powering things like your VIC-20s and later on your Commodore 64s and things. Massive fallings out with Jack Tramiel. One of the people who isn't there but is equally inspired is a guy called Bob Harp. Now, Bob Harp grew up in an area of the US with no electricity. That got him very interested in electricity because he'd quite like to have some. So one of the things he started getting into was building what were called crystal radio sets, little radio sets you could build that would just run off of almost their own innate power rather than needing things like batteries. He went and became a very talented electrical engineer. And of course, he was working at a place at the time called Hughes Research Labs, which was based in California, in Westlake, California. And the first thing he does the moment the Altair 8800 comes out is he goes and buys one. He wants to tinker with that. He really wants to tinker with that. But this isn't actually a story about Bob, because what he creates is something he calls his 8K baby, this is because Bob wants a lot more memory in his Altair. And being an electrical engineer, he decides the best way to put more memory in your Altair is to make your own board that puts more memory into your Altair. So he buys a bunch of chips, he sticks them on a board, and he creates this, which becomes the 8K memory board for his Altair. It's very good. He's a very good electrical engineer. He thinks, you know what, I could probably sell this, but I also have a job. I'm not going to get round to doing that. So he sticks it in the back of his shed, and it stays in the back of his shed. But the person who takes Bob's shed project and goes, Bob, if you're not going to sell this, I will, is his wife. So this is the point I'd like to introduce you to Lore Harp. And I describe her here as a founder in waiting because that's what she is. She met Bob in the 60s. They met in Los Angeles, I think. But Lore Harp, roughly this time in 1975, she's not a happy person. And this is something, and it'll be a theme through this talk that I want to talk about, is how history gets written or described in different ways. If you find mentions of Lore Harp anywhere, they will describe her, particularly when she founds her company, as a plucky housewife who is founding a business. That is the overriding narrative you will always find, even in the coverage at the time and beyond. Plucky housewife, Lore Harp and Carole Ely founding a business. Lore Harp, by 1975, has tried to be a lawyer. She's tried to be an anthropologist. The reason she has not been able to complete both is because she has 2 children while she's with Bob. And Bob is not a bad person, but he's a product of his time. And that means he absolutely expects Lore to be running the house, to bring the kids up, and do all those other associated things that involves being a suburban housewife, which is what she is and what society says she has to be. She has been doing this for a long time by this point. So she tries to pursue school and it hasn't worked. And as she described it, by 1975, she was 32 and she says she felt, my God, I'll be 40, the children will be gone, and where am I going to be? Now, I say that Lore Harp wasn't a traditional housewife in the way American TV liked to cast her, because she wasn't. She was actually born Lori Lang Hegeman. And the picture you'll see on the screen now is her. And she was born in Germany in World War II. And the person on the screen next to her is her grandfather. Her grandfather was a guy called Hermann Lang Hegeman. He was a business owner and politician in Weimar, Germany. So in pre-World War II Germany. It's hugely respected and influential in coming up with a lot of the financial systems that got Germany out of the Great Depression. Very anti-Hitler, and therefore did not last long in the Weimar political scene once things started to change. He was a firm believer in the principle that there should be no difference between the education of women and men. His own daughter, Lori's aunt, went on to be a very senior German judge. She studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. She studied at the School of Economics here, and then went to law school, all funded for by the grandfather. And Lori grew up in effectively ruined houses in Germany after World War II. And it was her grandfather that was her biggest influence on her. He very much insisted she could be anything she wanted in life and should be. In February 1964, when she's 19, one of her friends pulls out of a 6-month exchange visit to the US. Her friend, as Lori described it, had fallen head over heels in love with her boyfriend and insisted she couldn't leave him for 6 months. Lori, by contrast, turned around to her boyfriend and said, I will see you in 6 months, and went to the US instead. And this starts to give you an idea of the kind of person that Lori was, and Lori is, she's still with us. She is driven, and she always wanted to achieve things. So she tells her family that she's going to the US to study this. They agree. They insist it has to be 6 months, and she says, of course it should only be 6 months. It absolutely shouldn't be any longer than 6 months. 6 months later, Lore Harp sells her return ticket to West Germany and hitchhikes to Mexico. So again, just in terms of thinking about narratives here, every time you see Lore Harp described as a plucky housewife who is doing plucky housewife things, that's never been an accurate description of most people in life, and it definitely isn't an accurate description of Lore Harp. She returns to the US as an illegal immigrant, and she moves to San Francisco. She lives then in a shared house with 4 other women, and they all take off the books jobs to survive. They do babysitting, bar work, everything else. She is an active participant and member of the vibrant 60s counterculture society that's going on there. And this is when she meets Bob Harp. Bob is young, he's a PhD graduate, he speaks German, he drives a British sports car in San Francisco, which is like, wow. When it works. So they start dating, and she actually agrees then to move with him when he gets an offer at Caltech. So they move to Los Angeles, and it's while she's in Los Angeles that US immigration finally catch up with Lore Harp, and they are about to deport her. So of course, what they do, as you could do at that point, was they went and as she says here, they effectively went down. She got on, my hair was down, I put it in a big bun, I put on my pearl necklace, my father's gold bracelet, my grandfather's mother's ring. I sat there like little Miss Prim and Proper, and we said, oh, we just got engaged, we're getting married. We found some minister in our neighborhood, and then we went to McDonald's and had a hamburger. That's how Lori got married. And again, I think you can kind of start to build up the picture of the kind of person she is. While they're living in Los Angeles, Bob gets the offer to join Hughes Aeronautical Research. This is a hugely prestigious job, but it's also at a new research lab that is very far out. Overnight, Lori's life goes from image 1 there, the vibrant lifestyle you get in Los Angeles and San Francisco to time, to living in the place that looks exactly like that second wooded image. Westlake has literally only been built 5 years earlier as a town. It is very, very Republican. It is very white picket fence. It is very small. And that's really the fire environment she finds herself trapped in for almost 10 years. And that's why she is very much looking to do something more with herself. She feels like she's been, as she described it, she felt like a caged bird. And she has one good friend that she meets there. And that is a lady called Carole Ely. And you'll see them both on this screen now. So both of them decide they're going to form a company. Carole Ely is in a very similar position. They actually meet while they're waiting to pick up their children to head off from school. Carole Ely she was a bond trader when she got married. And of course, it was expected that Carole would give up her job and then raise the kids as well, despite being a very successful bond trader. She felt caged as well. So the two of them decided actually what they were going to do is start a firm together. They didn't have any money. Well, they had about $1,000. They looked into becoming travel agents. They wanted to set up a travel agency. What they quickly discovered was that to own and run a travel agency in Southern California at this time meant you had to be members of the right clubs because you had to make the right connections. And at least 60% of those clubs did not like people like Lore and Carole because they had the wrong genitalia. And therefore they were not able to join them. So actually what they started to do, and this is where it comes back to the Bob connection, is Lore was surrounded by computers. Bob loved computers. She'd become interested in computers because she was surrounded by magazines like the one that's on the image there, Interface Age. This was a magazine of I think it's the South California Computer Society. And she starts almost by osmosis to pick up everything to do with computing. You reach a point where you could probably ask Lore a question about chip technology and she could answer it almost as well as Bob could, because that was the only thing Bob ever talked about at home. So Lore starts to decides, well, actually, if Bob isn't going to do anything with this memory board, we'll do something with it. So she secures from him and says, well, if you're not going to sell this, why don't you let me and Carole have a go at selling this? And Bob says, sure, okay, gonna go for it. And so she rings up Carole and says, Carole, I know what our company's going to be. Our company's going to be a computer firm and it's going to sell 8K memory boards. Are you in? And Carole replies, yeah, I'm in. What's a memory board? So in August 1976, as I say, they visit one of the meetings of the Southern California Computing Society. We are in a computing society here now. Computing societies today, whilst the screens and technology are different, are not that different in terms of personalities and makeups as they have always been. What Lore and Carole quickly realize is that the entire home computing scene at the time is very male. It is full of people that look like me, that are bald and white, and also that everyone is very excited and very amateur. So what they witness at these meetings, and as Carole would later describe it, is they see attendees handing over bundles of money, sometimes as much as $1,000, which if you remember our previous conversion rate, you're talking like $7,000 in modern money, just bundles of money on a promise of some chips to be sent later, or getting chips and promising to send that money later. And these chips were given in like just Ziploc bags, you know, these light white bags, and you get a board and the instructions on how to assemble it would be someone would scroll down on the paper to say, yeah, put this chip in this spot and do everything else. They decide they can do that better. They can turn it into a more professional business. And so on August 23rd, 1976, they incorporate their own firm with an investment of $1,000 that they call Vector Graphic. They pick the name nothing to do with graphics as we know about today and everything else. It actually causes them enormous problems historically. And good luck finding anything on the internet about them because you cannot Google Vector Graphic. But ultimately they pick it because they think it sounds like a forward-thinking and useful name. Carole becomes head of marketing because she's got the better networking background from doing her role and doing bond work. Lore has always been a master organizer, so she takes on the role of CEO. Now, the first step, if you're going to found a memory board company, is you need some chips, because you need chips to put on that board. Lore and Carole still have a problem, which is that although they've formed a business, they do not look like the kind of people who should be running a computer business, and they certainly do not have any premises. So one of the things that Harp has to do when she starts out is really conceal what their business is and who they are. Because they're operating out of her kitchen and they're operating around school times and childcare times and everything else. So they know they need chips. They've only got $1,000, so they're going to need those chips on what I grew up calling on tick, on promise of money to come. So they contact one of the big chip manufacturers at the time. They contact AMD. They Harp manages to get in touch with someone from AMD and says, I'd like to buy 50,000 chips. The salesman says, that's no problem. Where's your office? I'll come down. Lore at the time is making this call from her kitchen table with a stew on, 2 kids running around. And so she says, actually, our office is being reconditioned at the moment. Can I meet you at the nearby Westlake Inn? That's what you're seeing there is the Westlake Inn. It has barely changed since the time that they were there, which tells you a lot about Westlake. There's your bit to edit out. It's all right, there's only about 6 people that live there. Harp diverts him to the Westlake Inn and they meet at the Westlake Inn. As she describes it, the moment he got out of his car and saw she was a woman, he stopped being interested in selling them chips and was more interested in her. Nonetheless, they carried on having the conversation. But what she quickly kind of found was the price they wanted was far too much. And also, this was because they were assuming that, he was assuming they were in the mainframe business. They were building big computers. And as Harp says, he hadn't even heard of what an Altair was. She was like, this is just not going to work. So they try again. They managed to get hold of someone at Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the other big companies, and they had better luck there. As Harp later describes him, his name was Ernie Alvarez, and he was an absolute silver fox. They got on very well. He understood exactly what they were trying to do. He not only agreed to sell them chips, he also agreed they didn't have to pay Fairchild for the first month they would deliver them. And that's how about a few weeks later, Harp is at home and there's a knock on the door. She opens it and a man named Dick Kirkpatrick is standing there, looking very confused as to why he's at a suburban house with a van load of microchips. And she says, yeah, stick them in the back room. We'll use them from there. And that's what they do. From the back room of Harp's house, they effectively create a board business. So they package them all up. They put them into bags. They work to a sales plan that was created by Carole Ely. So what they did, and this sounds crazy, but this was an innovation at the time, is what they did was they basically went through the back of all these magazines and everything else you got with all these dealers in, and they just took all the addresses and they just shipped them all 2 boards each. And then they rang them up afterwards and they said, what did you think of the boards? And if they liked the boards, they said, okay, well, do you want 6 more? But you got to pay us in advance. And the dealers loved it. They'd got the boards already. They tried them. So they did. They're $1 million business by 1977. And that's in 1977 money. Now, bearing in mind, they started in August. That's not a bad start. They got there by basically delivering a much more professional product than anyone else was. If you bought a board from them, it came in a box. It came with a printed set of instructions. They plated all the holes, the little bits and boards, so that it would actually, you had a far better chance of it, the damn thing working. The capacitors were color-coded. All the chips were color-coded. So if you were trying to assemble this board, you knew how to do it. And word got around that you're not going to have to buy extra bits. You're just going to get it and it's going to work. So that's what they do. They then actually start doing board assembly and sending fully assembled boards as well. And to do that, they start hiring high school kids. They start hiring high school kids, employing them in Lore's house to do it, college kids, anyone who can work. Fruit bowls full of chips, they're color-coded, you production line it. This all works, but what they later discover, or not later, is one day there's a knock on the door, and it's actually Harp's neighbor, Jean. Jean is a slightly older lady, and Jean has become intensely curious because for the last few months, all the neighbors have seen is lots of men in suits arriving at the house after Bob leaves for work and then leaving before Bob gets home. And it turns out that the entire neighborhood think they're running a brothel. And eventually Jean has become so intrigued by this that she's come over to see what's going on. Now, endlessly amused as Eli and Harp are, what they do is they actually show Jean what they're doing in that operation. And there is a serious side to this little story, because Jean has no idea what computers are, but she's incredibly impressed, and she's really impressed that they've managed to build their own business. And actually, Jean confesses then that she'd always wanted a job, but she never had one, never been allowed to have a job. You know, her kids are gone now, but she'd love to have a job, but she doesn't have any skills. She doesn't know how to do anything. Harp and Eli go off and have a quick chat. They come back and they say to Jean, we've decided we need a secretary. You're our secretary now. They give Jean her very first job. Jean goes on to become the head of vector graphics kind of admin arm, doing so many things. If you speak to Harp today even, and if you want to get a smile out of her, the easiest way to do it is to ask her what her favorite memory is, and she'll tell you it's the first day she handed Jean a paycheck. Jean had never had a paycheck before until Harp handed one to her, and that was Jean's own money. That wasn't her husband's money, that was Jean's money. And these are things that really mattered to them as they were building their business. And very soon they have a full factory, and they're building things in their full factory. By this point, it's become very clear that they don't just have a viable business, they have a big business, and they need to do more and they want to do more. And actually, this is the point where Bob actually leaves Hughes Aeronautics and joins the firm. He joins the firm at this point in the beginning of January 1977. And one of the reasons he joins is because Lore has decided that they need to do something more. Memory boards aren't enough. They want to build a computer. And this is the computer that they create. It's the Vector 1. It's designed by Bob, because Bob is a talented engineer. So Bob comes on board as their technology director, basically. It's built around an Intel 8080A chip. It also obviously runs an S100. It is effectively an Altair clone. But the big difference with it is it's got more expansion slots than an Altair. It's also available in multiple colors. It's the first computer that's available in multiple colors. Green apparently was the most popular. And it actually debuted at the 1977 West Coast Computer Fair. Couple of stands down from a couple of lads who had also built a business out of a basement building computers called Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. If you go back and read a lot of the literature about the 1977 West Coast Computer Fair, and I always find this interesting in how narratives get built, yes, people will talk about the Apple II that was announced there. There's also a lot to talk about the Vector 1. And a lot of that talk is because what they were building was what they called a turnkey machine. And this was based on feedback they'd had from their dealers, the people who were selling these things out in the wild. And what the dealers had said was they were starting to notice a difference in the companies and the customers that were coming into their dealerships looking for computers. It used to be people like me who liked tinkering with things. What they were seeing now was business people were coming in. And they were saying, I want a computer because I've heard I can run my accounts off it. I want a computer because I heard I could use it for writing better letters to people. And the dealers would say, I can give you that computer. And they would get an Altair or whatever off the shelf, they would hand it to them. And the businessman would say, what is this box of parts you have just given me? I asked for a computer. Now this feedback, because one of the things that Ely and Harp were very good at was maintaining really good tight feedback loops, what we now call kind of user experience investigation techniques and all of this kind of thing with their dealer network. And so when their dealers started saying, you know what, if you offered us a pre-built machine, we could sell that and they'll pay more for it, they decided to build one. Now, they weren't the first and only people out there being pre-built machines, but they were very rapidly built up a reputation for being the people that you went to if you were a small business and you wanted one of these things on that side of the US. And this quote is actually from some of the literature and reviews around that West Coast 1977 computer fair, where they said the folks at Vector have managed to come up with a rather slick-looking entry into the market. And that market is all theirs. Because the market they were talking about was the mid-sized business kind of market. They focused very heavily early on people like accountants, lawyers, doctors' surgeries, all those areas of business where they've got enough money that they can drop basically $8,000, which is again is about $40,000 today, on a machine that has the right memory boards in it to turn it into a word processor, to turn it into an inventory management system. And Vector would also hook you up with the consultants that can set those things up and do that. They offered almost that full service experience via their dealer network that would allow them to do that. They had that incredibly close relationship with their dealer network. They also, in technique terms, tended to focus on iterating their products line rather than going for big splashy new things. So actually what you'll find with Vector systems is, and you'll see some of them as we go through this, is they often all look very similar because they don't change very quickly a lot. They go with the fact that actually what we're dealing with here is business customers that do not want to be buying a machine regularly. They've just dropped 8K on a machine. They just want it to work and they want to use it for a while. That's a blessing, and later on it's a curse. But at this point, it's a blessing. This one you can see on screen, by the way, is a Vector Memorite. You won't see the small print, but yeah, that is, I'm not spot on the price. It's about 8,000. That is exactly how that machine would be set up and work. I know, look, you look at the picture and you go, all right, they've got a typewriter there for comparison because that's to compare it with the fact that it's a word processor. No, that typewriter is part of it. Effectively, that hooks into it along with the monitor, and it all pipes through that computer in the background, and that's how you're getting everything into the screen and on there and doing everything else. So that's the kind of stuff you're having to build, and you can see that's why Vector do well, because if you're a business, if you're a doctor, you don't want to know how to set that up. You just want someone to come in and do it for you, and you want it to work. And that's what they really do very well. They build machines that just work. And a lot of that is built on Harp's reputation. By now, they've got a factory. They're employing, at this point, about 300 people. And the thing that Vector do better than arguably anyone else at that time is run a production line. They are well regarded for having the most quality control, quality output production line in the entire area. And that is hard. At the birth of that computing era, the biggest problem that all the early computer companies have is churning out machines that reliably work. It's the big reason you don't sell pre-built computers, is because that way if it doesn't work, it's the customer's fault, not yours. If you're selling a pre-built one, it's got to work, or you've got to take it back and make it work, and that's even more work, and that costs you money, so just don't sell them pre-made. Harp turns out to be a phenomenal manager of production lines and of organizations, and we'll look at some of the reasons why in a bit. But I just wanted to put up this on screen is, if Adam Osborne was one of the leading sort of tech thinkers and journalists at that period. He was a regular at the Southern California Computer Show. He will regularly turn up writing in Interface magazine if you look carefully. That meant he encountered very early on Vector. In 1977, Osborne writes a book called Running Wild: The Next Industrial Revolution, which is an incredible book still, if you read it. There's a lot of things in there that haven't come true. There's a lot of things in it that absolutely have come true. He talks about computers becoming into every home, into every business. He talks about telecommunications becoming a thing in future and the need for networking. He talks about how actually this is a new era where new businesses can be founded. And the business that slap bang is in the center of that book, complete with pictures of all of them. That image you saw of that 8K baby card that I put on the screen earlier, that's Osborne's own 8K card. That comes from his book. Which now thankfully is out of print, so I can use the image. But essentially, Osborne turns around and goes, this is the kind of thing that the future can be. And Osborne, by about 1980, is thinking that he wants to build a computer himself. He will go on to create a computer called the Osborne 1. The Osborne 1 will have a strong case for saying it's the first ever portable computer. Portable in this instance means it weighs about the same as a small child. I'm not even joking. 3-year-old toddler, I think, is a general metric you use for saying how much an Osborne 1 weighs, but it is revolutionary. He knows when he wants to make this machine that he needs someone who can build machines well to do it. The person he goes to is Lore Harp, and he says, will Vector build my Osborne 1? And Lore Harp says, we will absolutely build your Osborne 1, Adam. I like you, I love you, but you're going to have to show me a prototype first, because I think this is going to be hard and we're going to have to get it right. Osborne decides actually that's too slow a process. He doesn't want to do that. He decides to go off, sets up his own factory, does it, everything else. If you're familiar with the history of the Osborne 1, one of the biggest problems that computer has when it comes out is enormous problems on its production line, and it cannot be manufactured well. And that slows down its sales, and it causes them fluctuations in sales that eventually contribute to their financial catastrophe that sends them bankrupt. This quote is actually not from Adam Osborne. It's on the screen. It's by a guy called Jean Delige, who was one of the few leading, but they're leading because there were only a few of them, venture capitalists at the time. They invested, Jean was one of the people who invested 750 grand into Vector to help them grow. Because as he said here on the screen, he said he did that because of Lore Harp. He said once the moment he'd met her and done that, he said she has enthusiasm, she has guts, she is precise, she knows every number, she fights for everything. She has leadership and people like to work for her. I think she's going to be the first woman to start a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And more on that later. So why is she so good? She's efficient and knows how to run a company. She spots problems before they start, but she's also very good and one of the first people to realize that the best people to tell you what's going wrong on your production line are the people who are working on the production line. They are not your C-suite executives. She starts from the beginning a process where random employees are taken out to lunch. You just get taken out to lunch by Lore Harp. And she says, what do you do? what are you working, what's not working, how do we make it work? She does that from the beginning. She provides, and Vector from the beginning provides daycare and childcare services to all staff. They have the highest percentage of women employed at the time in the industry. People like Jean, people otherwise, who then turn out to be incredibly motivated and incredibly loyal to Vector. They're paid reasonably well, they're paid around what you know. No one's paid less than their colleagues. But also the provision of daycare and childcare is huge. If you are a female sales staff member, if you're a woman who is working as a sales staff member or on any of the management roles for Vector, and you have to stay working late, you can expense any childcare expenses. Like in the same way as anyone else can expense their bar bill or whatever else, or their taxi home. Vector are unique. You can expense your daycare. And they're generous with their dealer network. They are very good at taking feedback. They're very good at providing training, and they're very good actually at giving the share of money and the revenue share they would give to people. There's a story the last point is relevant to this because she's also utterly ruthless. If you try and screw with Lore Harp, if you go into it thinking that because she's a woman you can just outthink her and do whatever else, she will destroy you. She is very, very good at what she does. One ex-Vector dealer I managed to interview told me that the only person in the entire valley who negotiated harder was Jack Trammell, who's the founder of Commodore. But we didn't mind it from Lore. With Lore, you'd actually get paid. Jack, you never got paid. A different dealer told me about, he was at a computer show and someone he knew came up to him and started boasting about how he got a great deal off of one of the sales girls on the Vector stand, because he'd been looking at their machines, and he'd said to the saleswoman, he said, "Do you know how these work?" And she said, "Why don't you tell me?" So he'd explained to her how computers work, talked her through everything to do with how computers work. And she'd asked him if he liked them, the ones that he was seeing. He said he did. And she said, "Well, what would be a fair rate then if she was for a dealer, if they were going to offer them?" Because she's just a woman, she doesn't know these things. So he suggested a number which he thought was really good for him, and he came over and he started boasting to this other dealer. And it was at that point that the other dealer took great joy in telling him that he just agreed to pay Vector twice the rate, or to get half the money that dealers normally got from Vector. Turns out that the woman was Lore Harp. And so he stormed back to the stand, as dealer told me he watched the guy storm back to the stand, an angry demand to get the same rate that regular Vector dealers got, now that he knew what they were getting, or he'd cancel the whole thing. And Harp said to him, "Go on then I can tell everyone else how you got beat by a girl." Didn't cancel, kept the rate. That gives you the kind of impression that that's the world that Harp and Ely are having to operate in, but Harp doesn't back down from it. She stands up to it, which takes us back to where we started actually, because they are a huge business. By 1980, they are the equivalent to what would be $100 million business today. They're running everything out of Westlake. They've got a factory at that point, about 500, 600 people. They're very efficient. They're doing everything they need to do. And so they go for their IPO. The IPO actually takes place, I think, in late 81. Harp does something extraordinary at that, and it relates to other things she did. When Vector hit its first $1 million month, when they first brought $1 million home in a month, Harp closed the entire factory down. The employees turned up and they found the factory closed and a lot of buses outside. Harp said, "We just made $1 million this month. We're going to go drink beer, have a barbecue and play baseball all day." And she took the whole company out to do that. And that was the kind of thing. She knew how to motivate her staff and do those things. And so when they went to launch the IPO, she insisted that every single member of staff got share and stock options. They would have an option to buy shares and stock. The reason she explained this, and it was behind her big philosophy, is what's on the screen there. She said, that guy in assembly who puts in the last screw, if he's really mad and he doesn't do it properly and quality assurance misses it, it's not just the guy back there who hears about it. But actually means that the computer's not going to work. It's then going to come back. It's going to ruin the entire company. You need people who are invested in your company and who care. She says everybody is deserving, not just those of us sitting in the front office. That is revolutionary at the time. So revolutionary, in fact, that the underwriters for the IPO offering tell her it can't be done. They say that there's no mechanism for doing it. And even if there was a mechanism for doing it, it would devalue the offering so much that investors wouldn't object. Harp told them that she didn't believe them, that they had 5 minutes to come up with a rough idea to how to do it, or she'd find different underwriters. They protested again and said, no, look, seriously, no one's done this before. The closest you've got is Apple, and they did a little bit, but only did it for certain people. They didn't do it for everyone. And so she listened to them. And then when they finished, she looked at her watch and said, you've just wasted 30 seconds. You've only got 4 minutes 30 left. You really are struggling to come up with how you're going to deal with this. I suspect you spend that time wisely. Within 4 minutes and 30 seconds, they had come up with a rough idea of how they would actually do it. And when Vector went public, it did indeed offer stock options to every single employee. The shares, I think, started at $7. If you're an employee, you had the option beforehand to pre-buy for $1 a share, which is, they lost a lot of company value by doing that. But they had a lot of very motivated staff as a result. She was not the first ever female founder of a company that to go public on the Nasdaq. She was second by 3 days. She didn't mind because actually the person who was first, who is well worth talking about at some point, is a lady called Sandra Kurtzig. Some people might remember, I very much doubt it. You should know Sandra Kurtzig's name because Sandra Kurtzig is the founder of a company called ASK Computers. They are one of the absolute pioneers who invent how you do logistics planning, electronic logistics planning and mapping. And they are one of the early companies that are big in what we call these days business productivity software. So before spreadsheets, they're working out how you do spreadsheet type things without spreadsheets. Sold out hugely for enormous amounts of money. That business was entirely founded and run by Sandra Kurtzig. Her and Lore Harp were really good friends because often at any computer show they went to, they'd be the only two women there. And that meant they had to stick together because frankly, they would often do their sales talks and sales shows in the same room because often a lot of these things were done at conferences, which you'd go to someone's hotel room and look at everything that was going on there. They'd show you your products in the hotel room. For that very reason, Sandra and Lore used to stick together. So they were very good friends. They had an informal competition to see who would get the first listing. When Sandra got the first listing, I've only heard this as a story, I haven't been able to prove it. So caveat with that, but is that Kurtzig held an enormous party, understandably, at a bar for all of this. When she got to the end of the bar, the party and tried to pay the bill, it was a very large bill, she found that Harp had already paid it. That was her kind of present to her for beating her. What happens next? Well, as with many of these stories related to this area of Silicon Valley, Big Blue arrives, IBM. And this is where Vector's story starts to change. So in late 1980, and even here their story is slightly different because actually in late 1980, Harp receives a visit from someone at IBM and is asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The person she receives a visit from is the man who's on the screen now. That man is Don Estridge. Don Estridge is the father of the PC. He is the man who effectively brings the IBM PC to market and frankly decides it should be open technology that everyone should use. It should be built on regular parts. The story in itself, another phenomenal leader and manager, which is why he does not last long at IBM. IBM are never happy that Don Estridge creates the PC because what they really want to do is sell mainframes, and you can't sell mainframes to people who've bought PCs because they realize PCs can do a lot of the things over the years that actually they were paying IBM's bigger computer divisions lots of money to do. But in 1980, when Estridge is starting to look at building and run, setting his PC arm up, one of the people he visits is Harp. Now, this is interesting because it's very hard, as is often the case with these things, to find the stories and the truth behind things. You get different accounts from different people. One of the things I try to do a lot is you go back to the records at the time. What were they saying in interviews at the time? What were the minutes on companies where they exist? Those kind of things you go back to. And what's very clear is in late 1980, Estridge visits Lore Harp, he visits Vector, and he tells her that IBM are thinking of dipping their toe into that microcomputer industry. He makes her an offer that says that what IBM would be interested in doing is buying vector machines, rebadging them as IBM PCs, and then using that as their first toehold in the market. Now, Harp tells him that whilst she likes him, that sounds like absolute rubbish, because IBM are a $25 billion company. They are a $100 million equivalent company. Why on earth would IBM be buying stuff off of Vector? So they talk, they eat, she shows him around the factory. He goes away with 4 or 5 Vector computers as examples, as they talk about maybe doing a deal. Harp is convinced from the word go that that is not happening, that IBM effectively are now, as she says it, she knew at that point they were going to be in the market, and that's her quote on the screen. She called her board together for an emergency meeting, which she said, we have 1 year, if that, the world is going to change. I think Harp is actually wrong when she thinks that Estridge and IBM were just tapping them up. I think actually IBM were more interested, or Estridge was far more interested in actually partnering than Harp realizes, because what Harp didn't know at the time, to a certain extent doesn't really know now if you talk to her, is that Estridge's big problem with setting up the PC wasn't building a PC, it was where the hell does he make it? He had exactly the same problem as Adam Osborne. Now, actually, as it happened, Estridge turned out to be able to throw together a production plant very quickly and turned out to be very good at running that side of things as well. But actually, at the time they were chatting, the biggest problem that he had on his plate was, where the hell do I build a PC if we come up with a design for it? So my strong suspicion is actually what that conversation was about, was a bit of a pre-tap to see if they could potentially use Vector as either a massive knowledge sink in cooperation with them to get Harp involved in setting up the production lines, or even potentially initially use Vector as a manufacturer, which they would then immediately drop or get rid of the moment they had their own setup in place. But as an initial element of that path, very similar to relationships they built up with other people, particularly around chips, Intel and beyond. So I think there's probably more to it than it thinks. But again, the big problem in this is Harp's absolutely right. IBM entering the market changes everything. And the problem for Vector is it really, really changes the market for Vector, because Vector are making machines that are targeting lawyers, doctors, nurses, small businesses. That is exactly the market that the IBM PC turns around and immediately collars. And what that really starts is the slow death of vector graphic. And there's a few reasons for this. It's not just that IBM turn up. At the time, there's a generational switch in technology that's going on as the architecture moves from 8-bit architecture to 16-bit architecture. Now, machines are coming out all the time. I think that's a Vector MX in the image there. That image, again, shows you why IBM is such a threat to them, because that's your standard vector setup. Give it 2 years and that picture is going to be a man on a PC. But Bob Harp is still in charge of technology at the time. Bob is absolutely wedded to 8-bit technology. He believes it's better than 16-bit technology. It's more efficient. He's very good at building 8-bit machines. And obviously Vector have a reputation for quality and consistency and everything else. He argues strongly and ultimately wins that they should do 1 more generation of 8-bit machines before they move to the next generation. It's not a bad decision. History says it was the wrong decision, because actually what they end up with is they end up with something called the Vector 3. The Vector 3 has 2 problems when it comes out. It's 8-bit technology, and everyone in the papers and everything is already talking about 16-bit technology. It also, and I have no idea why it went down this route, has a fixed keyboard. So effectively the keyboard is part of the case. Now that's something that other computers had at those time. Those computers were not meant to be used in that environment when you're sitting and typing on the damn thing all day. And actually Vector's USP had always been that they'd had a separate detachable keyboard. So what happens as a result is the Vector 3 doesn't sell. Now those customers don't jump away from Vector. They just go, well, we're not going to upgrade this cycle. We'll wait for the next cycle. So actually they go, well, we'll wait for the Vector 4 because we know you're going to release one eventually. But the problem Vector then have is before the Vector 4 comes out, the IBM PC comes out. So a lot of those buyers who would then naturally have been on a Vector 3 and they could have kept it going longer and moved and kept going, they're gone. Around this time, Harp Bob and Lore are going through a very nasty divorce. And that divorce, quite frankly, is largely motivated by the fact that Lore owns and runs a company and is the face of the company, and Bob isn't. Again, I don't necessarily mean that in the way of saying that Bob's a bad guy, but what he is he's a product of his time and his generation, and having a wife who is more successful than him, and a wife who is happy and open to be honest that she is successful. Lore Harp is appearing in Time magazine. She's on the cover of Inc magazine, as you saw there. She will go on to be on the cover of other magazines. Bob wants to know why it's not him on those magazines. He's the one who did the tech. He'd invented the machine. Lore's the one on cover. Bob's the one in PC magazine, in PC World, but he's not the one on Time. And that really gets to him. He actually, when I showed the picture earlier of the Inc magazine, when Lore is pictured on the front of Inc magazine after they go public, they get a whole bunch of copies sent to their house for free so they can give them out. Lore returns home to find Bob is burning them all in a burner. And she just turns around to him and says, "You can do that. It's not going to change anything." That's where their relationship is at that point. She's not the only one. Carole Ely, by this point, is divorced. She's gone through exactly the same thing. Her husband cannot cope with the fact that she is a successful businesswoman. It's just, in Westlake society, the horror. And that places an enormous strain on the business. And Bob is still their head of tech. You can't have a head of tech that is not talking to the CEO of the company because the two of them are going through a nasty divorce. It's not going to end well. That delays a lot of things. And it also means that Lore perhaps isn't prepared to listen to voices that say that they should move away from what Bob says they should do on the 16-bit tech stuff, because she's worried. They're both worried that their emotions are coloring the decision making. There's also another missed opportunity that comes in. Harp is really good friends with a guy called Bill Gates. Whenever Bill Gates has to be in what he calls the arse end of the world, he will often stay or work out of Vector's offices. So actually, he spends a lot of time at Vector. They're good friends. And when the IBM PC comes out, one of the things that Harp inquires about very quickly is, can they license Microsoft DOS, the operating system it runs? Because at the time they're using an operating system called CP/M, which is very common and very popular business leading operating system at the time. All the business software is on it. Vector manages to negotiate a deal with Gates that would actually see Vector become the first licensee of MS-DOS other than IBM, and that they would get it at an incredibly preferential rate, not quite a fixed cost, but a very good rate, a rate that doesn't scale or require extra fees every time a new version is released. I think the only people who come close to getting a deal like that is Jack Tramiel when he gets BASIC for Commodore, which is why Commodore has the same version of BASIC for its entire life, because Jack Tramiel is cheap and will never upgrade it, because then you'd have to renegotiate BASIC deal. But she takes it to the board to say that actually they should switch from CP/M to using MS-DOS. The board reject it because, understandably, again, it's not a bad decision for the time. They reject it because they point out that all the big business software is still on CP/M, that the only machine that really at this stage is operating on anything else is the IBM PC, and that what they'd be doing is risking alienating a lot of their customers, because it would be a huge change for those customers, because now all their software is not going to work. So either they're going to have to buy new software, they do whatever. There are lots of logical reasons not to do it. History shows it is absolutely potentially one of the wrong decisions. Certainly Harp herself says she sees that as the point where the situation went wrong, was unrecoverable at that point as things were going, because what it did is it meant that when eventually the PC won out, it wouldn't have made them instantly compatible, but it would have meant they were on the right path to compatibility earlier than a lot of others were, and the jump would have been far easier. And then beyond that, the biggest problem though is the IBM squeeze. IBM is stealing their customers left, right, and center because they can. They're IBM. No one's going to get fired for buying an IBM, and they're targeting the same sector. Despite all this, Vector's customers are loyal. They're generating good machines, and they keep their business. The company's still profitable. The company's still got a core. They're doing okay. But Harp now is very tired. She's been running this company since 1976. She's also been bringing up their two children. She's now well, very briefly a single mother after she separates from Bob. She actually marries a guy called Pat McGovern one day after their divorce officially comes through. Pat McGovern is one of the biggest IT publishing magnates ever. So yeah, if you Google her today, her name is Lore Harp McGovern. They are still, well, they were married right up until his death. They, I suspect, had been in love for some time, because she'd effectively separated from Bob sometime earlier. But so she married him. That meant moving potentially in an ideal world. And as she said, she wanted to spend time with her children. She now had children who I think were 5 and 9 years old, respectively. She just divorced their father. She promised them she would spend time with them. So actually, she steps back at the CEO at the end of 1982. The company's still profitable. It's a tough market. They've got to find a path to the future, but actually, they think they've got it. It turns out they don't. The glass cliff, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is very similar to the glass ceiling. The glass cliff is the principle that women only get given jobs as CEOs when the company is doing very badly, because there's no other reason not to give it to a woman at that point. And at least at that point it fails, you can say, oh, well, she didn't have the right stuff, did she? It is still a very common problem and principle today. Lore is a victim, very much so, of the glass cliff. In 9 months after she gave up the CEO-ship of Vector, the board contacted her in a panic. They'd replaced her with a guy called Fred Snow from Honeywell, and they have had 3 horrific quarters without Harp in charge. The production lines are not running well. The factory is not running well. They're losing dealers to IBM. No one is out there fighting and doing whatever. No one is giving a vision on where the company should go. No one is turning around and going, by now they've announced, this is the machine that's on the screen now, the Vector 4. And this actually says something to you about how hard it is to record this history. That's the best photo I've ever found of a Vector 4. If anyone in this room or anyone in this room, anyone knows anyone with a Vector 4, get me a better photo of a Vector 4, because that is the best photo I've found of a Vector 4, and that's actually from one of their brochures, a scanned version of one of their sales brochures. She agrees to take over Vector again because the investors and the board turn around and say, if you don't take this over, we're going to close down the company. We're just going to close it down. She does not want to see the company she has founded die, not least because there are 500, 600 people working in that company. What she does have to do, which she says is one of the most traumatic experiences of her life, she has to do a huge management overhaul. They have to do 25% of layoffs just to make sure that they're actually getting vaguely close to what the bank needs for them to carry on operating. She pivots the work on the Vector 5 to finally be their first fully IBM compatible machine. So the one after the Vector 4 will be a fully IBM compatible machine. You will get a Vector 5 that will be IBM compatible. It will have the same quality you've always been able to expect from Vector, etc., etc. The quote on the screen is from Harp herself. Harp does all this by commuting by plane, by domestic flight to Los Angeles, between Los Angeles and Burbank every day. And she does that because she has promised her kids she will spend more time with them. So she says here, I commuted every day to Los Angeles between here and Burbank. I would take a 6 a.m. flight. I'd get to Burbank. I'd have my car in the parking lot, go to the office at 8:30. And at night, I'd try to get the 6 o'clock flight back so I could have dinner with my kids a little late, but still have dinner. And the next day, I'd do the same thing again. It's something like that is something I always come back to when you later on the press really lay into Harp after Vector finally fails about how women don't have the right stuff to be CEOs. She's doing everything on top of being a CEO as well. And she actually turns Vector round. Vector, again, gets back to a position where there is a path forward. It's not safe. It's still losing money, but it's close to not losing money. Harp's plan that she puts to the board at this point is she says that what they need to do is find their niche as an IBM compatible computer. There's no point going toe to toe with IBM. What they need to do is find what they had before versus the Altair. How do you find something that goes with this but a bit more? This is why you should you should be us. She decides or argues that the element of that is they have to be high-end computers, and they have to be high-end computers in some way. They have to be specialist IBM machines in some way. The plan that she comes at, though, what she identifies as the area they should aggressively target to be better at is something that Vector had actually tried doing early on with their System B and various things when they had those big office setups, you know, like you see it in there, which is something called networking and telecommunications. Harp says that the future is going to be telecommunications and networking for small businesses and beyond, not just for big businesses. She says what Vector should do with the 5 and beyond is focus on being the early players and the leaders in telecommunications and networking. Now, I don't think this is entirely her idea, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just I mean that in a she's a smart woman and she speaks to people way. You've met him on screen a few times already, which is Adam Osborne. Adam Osborne, by this point, is lost. The Osborne one has gone spectacularly wrong, but that doesn't mean that Adam Osborne isn't a smart man who knows what he's doing and is very good at predicting where things are going. And Adam's books, if you read them, talk an awful lot about networking and telecommunications being the future. You can find it online. There's a show in the US that runs throughout this whole period called Computer Chronicles. If you ever want an absolute bit of joy of period television, it's all on YouTube. You can go and watch old episodes of people in 1981 banging on about computers and how much they love them, and it's really good fun. There is an episode of that from this period on which the 2 guests are Adam Osborne and Lore Harp. Adam is there post-Osborne, promoting his new software company. She's there talking about Vector and where the industry is going. They are good friends, and it's very clear from the way they interact with each other that they are good friends. I have very little doubt that actually they were talking a lot about where the future should be, and I suspect that it was a bit of a combined plan. None of this matters, of course, because the board rejects the plan. She does not own a majority of the company. She cannot force it through anymore since the IPO and beyond. The board reject it. They decide that the Vector 5 when it comes out, is going to be good enough, and they'll just happily take whatever bits of PC clone market they can get. And what they'll actually do instead, and what they want Harp to do, is slash another 25% jobs and find more efficiencies until then. Harp, as she describes it, went to her lawyer's office, cashed in her shares, quit, and had a cry. She said, "I'm done. I'm not doing that. You want to do that? That's your plan, not mine." And that's when she leaves the firm. She walks away forever in 1984. That's when she walks away. That's the overview of the Vector story. It's an incredible story. There's a lot more to it, but that's the broad strokes of it. What I also want to talk a bit about, though, is why does no one know that story? And that's one of the areas I look at in history terms and everything else as we talk about is all historical narratives have gaps. We are human beings. Human beings like stories. We have liked stories since we were gathered around fires. And actually what tends to happen is our stories are colored by the society we live in and the environment we're in. And there are a number of reasons why Vector and Harp are overlooked. Some of them are on the screen here. Tech history likes winners. Everyone wants to write another book about Steve Jobs. Everyone wants to write another book about Bill Gates. No one wants to write another book about Adam Osborne. No one wants to write another book about Lore Harp. Their companies are not here. And that's not just that means they fall out of the narrative. It also means that their own companies aren't still around to push that narrative. It's fair to say that a good reason why we all still know Steve Jobs and how amazing he is because Apple are very happy to put money behind telling everyone how they are the inheritors of Steve Jobs' legacy, et cetera, et cetera. That's always been the case. Tech history likes winners. We like success, particularly Silicon Valley, particularly as you then move into startup culture and beyond. The big people we hear about are the big flamboyant white guys, says the white guy waving his hands around like me, who do stuff like this. We are the people who get the focus. It also has a tendency, we have a tendency both in tech history and beyond to preserve and reinforce existing narratives. It's why in military terms, you're always hearing the same stories about D-Day again. It's why you're always saying the same stories about the dam busters. It's all of that. If you are a writer and go to a company and say, I want to write a book about a thing, you say, I want to write a book about D-Day. And they go, oh, brilliant, write a book about D-Day. But you need something new in it. You need something new in it because it's got to be new to sell. And you go, okay, well, here's all the amazing stuff no one talks about D-Day. And they go, brilliant. Can you also put in all the stuff everyone knows already? Because if you don't put in all of that stuff, all the Amazon reviews are going to say, wow, it was a good book, but it didn't talk about Sword Beach or something like that. Tech is exactly the same in the same way. And this is why it's always easier to pitch and sell. And that over decades builds up into a picture where people get lost from narratives because narratives get reinforced. It also is because stories get reinforced. What tends to happen with stories, particularly in the tech world, is you'll get stories about, I'll talk about one later, but you'll get, oh yeah, did you know the story about how this happened? How this thing got, did you know the story about how the first time that the software ran on the Altair 8800, the first time I tried to run BASIC on it, it didn't run. And Bill Gates had to frantically recode it in the room and do all of that. Well, Bill Gates wasn't in the room when the Altair 8800 first ran that code. His partner was. Paul was in the room when that code ran because Bill was still back at college, and actually they faxed over the code overnight because it didn't run first time, they had to run it again. But stories get retold as if people were there. You find that a lot if you listen to oral histories of tech, and when I have to filter through all histories, is you go, I can go back and look at the minutes for that meeting. I can go back and look at the print and the time, and I can tell you damn well weren't in that room you say you're in at that time. But you probably think you were because it's now 50 years on and you've heard that story and retold that story enough. So that reinforces those existing stories. Vector's focus on business computing is another reason. Hence why we haven't got a lot of pictures. A lot of computers that get preserved a lot of the time are the ones that we all remember from growing up, we had at home. It's easy enough to go on eBay and find yourself a Commodore 64. Millions of the things everywhere, you can get them, no problem. Try getting a Vector. You could see from some of the photos I've shown you that actually even just finding out the specifications on a lot of these machines now is really hard because the machines don't exist anymore and there are no big global fan clubs maintaining archives of all of this information. You know, no one is there trying to go on Twitch and play games on a Vector 4. It's not happening. So we don't have that element of content to it. And finally, is this something that's very specific to tech and is very, very understandable, but also odd. I call this the inventor effect. And you can sum it up as they didn't actually make it though, did they? Which is that actually what tends to happen a lot in tech history and computing history is we go, yeah, but they weren't the one that held the soldering iron. So they didn't invent it. They're not important. The important person is the person who did the soldering, who had the idea that actually came up with that chip layout and did everything else. Yes, those people are important, but actually that doesn't cover a lot of people who are critical to the computer revolution. And the thing is, we're actually quite good at recognizing that in some cases. The only time Steve Jobs did anything to do with a chip was when he was telling Steve Wozniak to do them when he was working when Jobs was technically employed by Bushnell at Atari, and Bushnell hired him because he knew Jobs would get Wozniak to do the work on the sly. He was a software guy, and then he was a brilliant ideas man and did everything else. He hugely influential in the direction of technology and everything else. He's not a soldering iron guy. He wasn't one of those guys who's getting down and dirty, but we recognize that he's important. He gets the exemption. He's allowed to be in that club. Jack Tramiel is the guy next to him, founder of Commodore, and later takes over Atari. Ruthless businessman, Holocaust survivor. It's one of the reasons is where his drive comes from. He turns around and says that one of the reasons he does it is because he wants everyone to have computers, because he wants information to be everywhere, because he never wants that kind of thing to happen again. But he's a ruthless businessman. His knowledge of computing largely comes from everyone around him. Chuck Peddle, who we had on the screen earlier, was one of the inspired people. He's the guy who comes up with a lot of those chips and those designs for the VIC machines, for the Commodores, for all of those. But we accept that Tramiel is important to computing. Adam Osborne there we've talked about already. People talk about the Osborne 1. He was a journalist who then became a futurist. Didn't build computers by hand. And then finally, Don Estridge we met earlier. Don, again, was an inspired manager. He was a brilliant manager, fantastic manager, ran amazing production lines, came up with broad ideas and then got engineers to go off and do them. That sounds very familiar, actually, to certain people we've been talking about here. One of the big reasons, and I'm always big on being subtle on slides. So if we ask why did they get exemptions and Harp and others don't? I mean, the simple answer is that word. It's sexism. And that's not necessarily conscious sexism for a lot of the industry at the time, but it is a thing that's very prevalent then and now. And it means that certain founders and certain people are not granted the same exemptions. And actually they drop out of history as a result. It's like you tell Harp's story to people now and everyone goes, that's a great story. But if a bit further along and she wasn't still alive and we weren't able to look at these things up, we wouldn't know that her story exists. These are hidden histories. This is actually the only list of key female figures in 1982 in the computing industry I have found in years of trawling through books, both actual books picked up in shops and on archive.org and libraries and everywhere else. I'm not going to read out all the names that are on this list, but just to say there are hundreds of women that should be honored in today's computerist activity. To name a handful are Giovanni V. Mix, president of EDPI Computer. I've highlighted Lore Harp's in there. If you love games, Roberta Williams is on there from Sierra Online Systems. Phenomenal influence on where video games go. There's a few other interesting names, and I think Isaacson's in there somewhere as well. Do you want to know where this text is from? This is from the introduction to the Dirty Book 1982, a user guide to erotic software. If you want to spend $30, the equivalent of what, $70 now, on a version of pixelated porn, you buy this and then you fill in the form in the back and you send it off and they send you some discs with it on. The intro in that is the only place where it goes, of course we're doing this, but we really do need to acknowledge there are a lot of amazing women in this business doing amazing things. And here is all the names of people that you should actually look up and find out a bit more about. Weirdly, and this is a massive sidebar, but I think that intro was written by Adam Osborne because he knew the publishers. I know he knew the publishers because you've done some stuff with that publishing firm. He was famous for writing sort of anonymous pieces every now and again. And so when he did, he used a slightly different tone of voice. The tone of voice in that intro is very similar to Adam's tone of voice. And if you look really closely at it, if you're a copy editor type, you'll spot that it uses British spelling. And Adam Osborne was British. But that highlights the invisibility that exists at that time even. And if it's invisible at that time, it's hard to look back and now and rebuild those pictures. That's very true and absolutely pertinent to Lore Harp herself. Here she is on the front cover of another magazine, The Executive. So what's clear, and when we talk about this, is we've talked about people like Osborne, like Estridge, like Gates. The key figures at that time in this industry saw Harp as a peer. They saw her as someone to work with, to do things with. Like the people at the top saw her the way she is and the way she was. What's interesting though is if you dig into the accounts at the time, is that the more successful Vector and Harp becomes and the more she's on the front of those magazines, the more the industry beneath that level, beneath that founder and creator level, the people doing the genuine thinking, start to turn and see her as a threat. That really happens after the IPO. Just after the IPO, she is a young female, a young woman who's a developer who started out as a software developer, writes to her, who's now working for Vector in one of their software arms because they make word processing software for their machines and things like that. She writes to Harp and says that she's really proud to work at Vector, but she's always really frustrated and gets angry. And whenever she says she works at Vector in certain places, there's always, as she described it, some guy who will go off on a big rant and at the end of it go, it's a great firm, apart from, and you have to pardon my language here, apart from that awful bitch running your company. And actually what she asks her in the letter to Harp is she says, how do I deal with that? Like, how do you deal with that? You must get that. How do you deal with that? Harp's reply, or what she replied is on the screen now. She says, I sent a nice note back and I said, I especially enjoyed the comment about this bitch running the company, because that poor guy is either so jealous or he's so stupid that he doesn't have anything else to talk about, and I must be terribly important in his eyes. That's what the world she was working in. And when you see that in that atmosphere, it's very easy to see why the moment there were elements of cracks of failures that started to creep in, it starts to be seen as, oh, well, of course she was going to fail. There's a 1981 Harvard Business Review interview with Harp. It's in a selection of business reviews and interviews with CEOs. The thing that comes across in that is that every other CEO in that is asked what their management techniques are. They're asked what they do, how do they run a company, why are they so successful. 50% of Harp's interview is that at most. The rest of it is trying to get her to tell her position on feminism. It's them trying to get her to talk about whether she feels being more emotional is a problem running a business. How does she overcome that? All of those kind of things. Harp bats an awful lot of it away, but that's the environment she's working in, and that contributes to why we don't remember her now. After she leaves the firm in 1984, and remember we saw Inc. magazine earlier with her on the cover, there is an absolute hit piece on her. You can still read it online if you've got an Inc. subscription. On her, she doesn't speak a lot after she leaves Vector about Vector, because she knows that anytime she speaks up, people are just going to go, well, that's, of course she's going to say that it wasn't her fault or anything else. This is only the only times I found where she actively responds to a hit piece on her in 1984. What's not helping here is Bob Harp. By now, Bob is working someone else. I think he's at Corona. He's founded a company called Corona, who've gone to make PC clones. I think it's Corona. When Vector starts to fail, Bob is right on there turning around and going, this is because I haven't had a good idea since I left. He's straight onto every tech press. That's his thing. And that's what he believes. That's Bob's position on life. But people print that. The piece is actually by Joshua Hyatt. I think he's still writing now. He effectively says, well, of course the company was going to fail, emotional lady. He describes her as a perennial dropout student. This is a woman who had to give up on 2 degrees because she had children and didn't get the support. He describes her as a perennial dropout student, failure, no wonder it all came to the end, all this kind of stuff. This is the only time I've seen her respond, and she writes this. And the piece was originally called Lore Harp, Better to Give Than Receive. And I think the title of that tells you exactly the kind of attitudes that were coming through in a lot of that piece. Although replying might be interpreted as acknowledgement, defensiveness, emotionalism, and more, it is in fact none of the above. The issue involved is deeper than hitting Lore Harp. It is the implication that, after all, a woman couldn't hack it, and I take exception to that. There are numerous companies that have, in fact, gone out of business, and Vector is not one of them. At the time, she's just left, and they are still stable. And I don't recall any of those company presidents have caused as much stir or been given as much attention as I have. And that's true. And that's, for Lore's part of this story in particular, I do want to leave that there. It's a kind of thing of saying that actually this is contributing to the reasons why we don't know about these people. It's not that this is history that's new. It's not revisionist. It's that we are left not hearing these stories. And I think it's important to consider these things. And frankly, it's important for me to be up here saying this, because these things matter and they need to be talked about. And some of these stories need restoring. They need to be analysed properly and what went wrong. But it is worth acknowledging why these stories aren't told. I just want to finish with a little bit of a consideration on this, which is, could Vector have survived? Now, it's always dangerous as a historian, as anyone, to go, well, what if? But a slightly adjacent thing you can do is, what are the paths not taken? And what you can do is say, where were those points where things could have diverged? And what were the challenges that would have been faced if those points had diverged? Bob Harp on a different technical path is probably the first one. If he'd been less wedded to 8-bit technology, would it have changed things? You're going to get 16-bit technology, but actually, realistically, what's very clear from what Bob Harp then does with his subsequent companies, he goes into the business very quickly of making PC clones, so IBM clones, like literally just making a PC like other companies do. The company is, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but They get effectively almost sued out of oblivion by IBM about 2 years later for just wholesale copying IBM technology. They just get patent lawed straight out. I think they end up getting taken over by Daewoo, the Korean firm. There's zero reason not to think that that's exactly what, if that's what Bob did at his new company, that's what Bob would have done at Vector. And if Vector had done it, IBM would have come after them for more than just a slap on the wrist. They would have driven them out of business. The shift to MS-DOS is the other question. I personally think that Harp might be right on this. I don't think it would have saved them. I think it might have given them a fighting chance. It would have left them more adjacent to being able to switch than possible. Doesn't mean they would have survived, but different. The other option that you get a lot of talk about in when you look at press afters about the thing that the press and the tech press say they should have done. They say, well, look at Compaq. They say what Compaq did, and Compaq are brilliant, hugely worth the talking themselves what Compaq do. Compaq emerged as the leading PC clone manufacturer. And by 1987, 88, they are actually leading the industry. They've taken over from IBM. Everyone says, well, why didn't Vector could have done a Compaq? What that kind of misses is the fact that there was a company doing a Compaq at the time, and that company was called Compaq. You can't be the Compaq if Compaq exist. It's not a gap in the market. And then finally, there's Lore Harp with the telecommunications niche. Again, I don't think it's guaranteed success. I think what we see later on effectively is the bar on technology on being a high-end machine is dropping so fast at this time. One of the fun things I have when I write pieces on this and with copy editors and editors is you'll get into the piece and they say, right, and then you say, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. They say, what year are we in now? And so we're still in the same month. Like, that's how fast the tech is moving. But the telecommunications niche might have been there, but actually one of the things that causes IBM problems is how quickly things like in Compaq do this, is bring what becomes the 386 chip to market after the 286 chip. One of the reasons Compaq are able to step ahead of IBM is because IBM tell Intel that they don't want to bring the 386 chip, the third iteration of that chip, to market yet, because IBM know it will cut into their bigger computer businesses, because those chips are fast enough now that they can do a lot of the things that until now IBM have been selling huge machines to companies to do. Actually, Compaq then turn around to Intel and go, well, if IBM aren't going to do it, do you want to do it with us instead? And Intel go, yeah, we'll do it with you instead. The whole story around that is fascinating. But there's no reason to think that maybe Lore Harp, she might have been right that that was where the niche was going, but that might have been a niche that disappeared within a year anyway as technology improved and sped up. It's one of those ones where I kind of feel, my personal feeling is Vector was probably the gap that could have threaded, the hole that the needle needed to thread for that company to survive, just because of the nature of the environment they're in and the era was tiny. I suspect if it existed, it was the shift to MS-DOS, or the telecoms could have done it, but it would still have been a serious roll of the dice. That doesn't detract from everything that Harp, that Ely, and even Bob Harp achieved with Vector. But it is worth being pragmatic and acknowledging there is a reason Vector died, and it was because sometimes your company just loses its place that it can be. There is a final thought, though, is on 11th of September 1983, Rod Canyon, who is the chair of Compaq, announced that the entire industry, effectively, or the leading companies of the industry, were rebelling against IBM. IBM at the time had just announced they were moving to a new type of PC technology called PS2, not to be confused with PlayStations. And the reason for that was IBM was trying to take it all proprietary and back in-house. They wanted everyone to license stuff from them. Canyon and Compaq were the driving force that stopped that happening. And they stopped that happening by getting together people like Bill Gates, like Andy Groves, I think is head of Intel, all these people, all the guys from HP, the other clone manufacturers, together, and went, we're going to carry on making PCs like we always have, even if IBM doesn't. And they effectively saved the industry as we know it by doing that. They became known as the Gang of Nine, because the companies that did it, there were 9 leading manufacturers that signed up to do this. There are actually about 56, I think, in total companies that do it, but your Premier League ones were the 9. If Vector had survived, if Harp had pivoted earlier, because remember the company is still technically around at 83, but they're not in those conversations because they're not on the clone platform. I do find that there is an interesting thing. I would have loved to see what would have happened if Harp had been sat next to Canyon when they were doing that rebellion against IBM. Canyon won, the Gang of Nine won, but it was a close run thing. I suspect it would have been a hell of a lot less close run if Harp had been on that platform as well. But that's it really. I mean, some stuff on screen if you want to find other things I've written or anything else. But yeah, I mean, if you've got questions both now and afterwards, Blue Sky, you can find me on there, Mastodon, Twitch, YouTube. You can email me. As I say on there, I guarantee you I'll be in the nearest pub to this building the moment this is over. But in the meantime, yes, I mean, I'm happy to take questions if there are any from your running questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Gareth, and what a good thing you're around to do all the research and publication and lecturing. That absolutely riveting. I'm going to hand over to Dan for questions from chat and from the floor. We've got some time for.
Okay. Getting a lot of congratulations for the lecture on that. There's a couple of points about people who might have been included in your list of ladies like Grace Hopper and so on, but perhaps she doesn't come into exotic.
I think, yeah, questions about including people like Grace Hopper on my list. I completely agree. They're also interesting examples of the ones who have somehow managed to penetrate through and get that element of knowledge to it. And yeah, I mean, there's some Grace Hopper is incredible. There are incredible interviews with her that you can see online. But what I always come back to is for every Grace Hopper, there are probably 9 other Grace Hoppers that we don't know about now.
Yes.
And probably 5 of them that are at best ones we could still hear about. And every single year, the chances of hearing about that drops.
Just another one here. Is there actually a written history of Lore Harp and Vector? Or
Is there a written history of Lore Harp and Vector? There is not a written history of Lore Harp and Vector. Something I didn't mention in this is that up until, well, just before I started writing about Harp as part of my tech history column on there, which as a self-plug will eventually be a book. I will do a book on this, on everyone else, and all these kind of things mentioned. Right now, I'm very lucky. Every are paying me to write long-form history columns. There are pieces on there that you can read about Ed Roberts, Don Estridge, everything else, and they've been stupid enough to leave me the entire book rights for it. So yeah, they will be going into books. But pertinent to that is, again, this is about hidden histories. There is a fantastic project which is worth looking into, and I can't remember the name of it right now. And they're on Blue Sky now as well. They were on Twitter, which is a detailed project to try and actually look at things like Wikipedia and really rewrite things and use these sources to get more exposure to key female figures. Before I wrote the column on Harp for Every, and remember, all this information is out there. You're just going to coordinate it. Harp's Wikipedia page was exactly 1 paragraph long. And it basically said that she was married at McGovern, and then it said she worked at a company called Vector Graphics for a while. So there was a single paragraph and it's wrong. I am very proud, and I think this is what's important of doing these things. If you go on Lore Harp's Wikipedia page today, it does not look like that anymore. And I didn't write what's on there, but enough people now know and are doing the other research that she's showing up. So yeah, that's the long answer. The short answer is, I suppose, give me a year and you might find one from me out there on all of this stuff.
certainly more than 1 paragraph now.
Yeah.
We've heard about the first 40 years of Lore's life. Another 40 years has gone by since 84. Roughly, what happened to her? What did she do?
So the question in the room is we've heard about the first 40 years and what happened in the next 40 years of her life. I could do you another hour on that. She goes on to be one of the foundational proper venture capitalists who funds small businesses and startups, or she tries to be, because she's rich. Vector makes her rich. She's also married to Pat McGovern. Pat McGovern is beyond rich. We're talking brilliant status. And what she tries to do is found a venture capital firm that looks at promoting small businesses and gets businesses going. Because as she describes it, the thing she loves is building people as much as building companies. She leaves that business very quickly because she finds that people are quite happy to take her money, but whereas they'll happily let someone like Ben Rosen, who goes on to be on the board of Compaq, on their board, they don't want Lore Harp on their board. They'll take her money, they don't want advice from her. Because why would they want advice from a woman? What can she know? She gets out of that industry very quickly. She's disillusioned by it. In 1988, I think, she pops up again. She actually invents I think it's called the funnel, which is a disposable and hygienic way for women to use a urinal. And she invents it because she had to travel so often on business and do everything. And she'd been in all these venues where the only toilet you could get into was a male toilet, or where the only toilet that would exist would be one that had a urinal in it. She invents that. It's very much loved by everyone who uses it. And the big problem is she can't get it advertised anywhere. Stations, TV stations will not take adverts for it in 1987, 88. And so it drops out of existence. Her long-term legacy, and she is still around now. She is on LinkedIn still. If you hunt around, you can probably find her email address. I've spoken to her. And if you're an entrepreneur, drop her an email. She'll still happily tell you stuff, and she's still a very smart mind. But actually, her legacy really now is, and it was a joint thing with McGovern before he sadly died about 10 years ago, I think, is the McGovern Institute of Brain Research. It is the foremost research establishment into brain conditions and everything else in America. And they joint funded it with a $350 million donation. And that is her long-term legacy. So yeah, the next 40 years, I always feel the next 40 years highlight, like, if Vector could have been a flash in the pan, so to speak, but actually, if you look at what she went on to do and you sit there and go, if that was what she achieved with the barriers she faced, imagine what we could have seen if she'd stayed on as a leader within the industry. Like, that would have been really interesting. So hopefully that answers the question.
It's interesting. One of our people online has said he can understand, Ian Sillers says he can understand about the resistance moving from CPM to MS-DOS, having done it himself.
Yeah, I mean, understanding the resistance from moving to CPM to MS-DOS completely, which is why I think it's not, you can't say it would have been the easy win. I think this comes back to what I was saying, is that there is no easy option. There is no easy path that Vector didn't take to survive. I think if they tried to shift an entire business and shift every single one of their customers to a different operating system, they're going to lose customers doing that. So you're into the gambling territory of, if you're playing pontoon, if you're playing 21, they're sat there on a 16 and they're going, can we win with this hand? Theoretically, yes, but there's no good option.
Alan, yeah, a couple of observations about how sexist the industry was. My wife, Joan, before I knew her, did her MPhil and then went for a job at IBM. The interview, they looked up surprised and thought, oh, we were expecting a John.
Yeah,
They didn't expect women to be applying for jobs at IBM.
Yeah.
And then in my 50 years as a journalist, certainly back in the 70s and 80s, I would go into a press conference with about this number of people and about the same male-female ratio. And the man at the front would say, and it'd be a man at the front, would say, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Yeah, so that's
it. Was horribly sexist.
Two observations in the room there, yeah, about good afternoon, gentlemen, in press things as back in the day is a good example of the sexism in the room. And also, yeah, going to a job interview at IBM when you're called Gene and being told, they're expecting a job. There are a lot of other stories like that in this industry. I think one of the things, and it kind of relates actually to Harp's thing, is, I talked about narratives, how narratives get skewed. I'm sure there are many people in this room, if I turned around to them and said, can you tell me how, it's relevant to our earlier conversation, why the IBM PC ends up with Microsoft DOS on it instead of CPM, there'll be at least one person who says that the reason it did that is because Gary Kildall, the man who invented CPM as a software, was in a plane flying when the IBM people came to meet him to try and license their software. And then Bill Gates, they got frustrated that he wasn't there and they went to speak to Bill Gates instead. Absolutely not true. Entirely not true. There is a glimmer of truth in it. But the glimmer of truth, what actually happens that day is that the meeting takes place. Gary isn't there. The person who is there is Dorothy McEwen, his wife, Dorothy McEwen Kildall, his wife. Dorothy runs the company. Their company is a joint effort, always has been, always was. Dorothy is the business brains, Gary is the techie. Gary does all the tech, he created the operating system. He was a genius. He was also a very troubled man. He had mental health issues and died tragically young, alcoholism as well. But there was no reason for him to be in that meeting. Why would he be in that meeting? In fact, he was explicitly banned at that point from doing deals with people because 6 months before, Adam Osborne, who we have already met, walked into his office and said, Gary, I'd really like to use CPM on that Osborne 1 I'm making. Do you want the money up front or do you want a license fee for every Osborne 1 I sell? And Gary, being Gary, said, oh, it sounds like a lot of paperwork. If we get a license fee of everything, just give me 25 grand. Probably cost the Kildall company about digital research, I think it was called. Originally intergalactic digital research, and then Dorothy said he had to drop the name, the intergalactic bit from the company name because it was stupid. She was right. But yeah, basically that cost him about 50 grand. And it's a lot of money in that time. So when IBM came calling, IBM offered them a similar rate, or actually more, they offered them 250 for the IBM PC. Dorothy said, we're not taking a fixed fee deal, but we're happy to chat. And they were in the middle of negotiating. While they were in the middle of negotiating, one of the people who was negotiating, I think it was a guy called Jack Sams. Jack Sams had gone to university, or been at university while Gates was there with Bill Gates. And obviously both digital research and Microsoft are based in Seattle. They had an informal agreement not to compete. The Kildalls wouldn't make things like BASIC, and Microsoft in return wouldn't make things like CPM. When Gates discovers that the deal is not done and that there is room to maneuver, that's when he goes to another Seattle firm, buys a bit of software called Kudos, contacts Jack and says, if you're that desperate for an operating system, I can give you one, and I can give you one cheaper than digital research can. And IBM are in a rush. They need to get that PC out. They don't have time to negotiate. So they do the deal with Microsoft instead. That is the story of how that ends up. The reason I tell that story is because the reason the Gary Kildall being on a plane story works and sticks in the memory is because of our perceptions on roles in society. The reason it works is because, oh, well, of course Gary needed to be in the room. Why would they do a deal if Gary wasn't in the room? Because Dorothy was in the room, and Dorothy was the one who mattered. If you do lots of research to work out the origins of that story, by the way, and you look at all the tales and people who go, I heard, I was there when, all back, they all come back to one man, and that man was Bill Gates, who I would argue is not necessarily a reliable narrator in a series of events in which he screws over one of his former friends and competitors, and then gets sued for it as a result. But yeah, just as an example, yeah, it's that's how the industry works.
I've just had a comment here from Kate Hannay saying, it still happens. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
100%.
Yes, you take the one.
You were talking about stories being forgotten because of sexism and the biases there. Do you think it is also likely that there are stories forgotten because of racism?
Yes, I mean, so story on in the question in the room is are stories forgotten for other reasons than sexism, such as racism? The answer is absolutely 100% yes. What this is all about is about the fact that the way and this is human culture as human culture is we bring our perceptions with us wherever we go. This is why I won't get onto the bandwagon of this, is why you should never trust anything that bangs on and gets really angry about the history being revisionist. The point of history is for it to be revisionist. That is the entire point. We evolve our perspectives and we find out more things. Very short comment on that, not related specifically to this, but I'm a military historian as well. If you had turned up at Portsmouth in the 19th century as a sick sailor and gone into one of the hospitals there, you would have been surrounded by black nurses, because an enormous percentage of the nurses in the 18th century in Portsmouth were from various places around the empire. And the reason they do not show up in the historical record, and we did not know and really understand that until some very good research about 5 years ago, is because they were all slaves. And therefore, if you went through the pay records for the Royal Navy, you would find lots of mentions of white, female, even the male nurses being paid, but you would not find the records of those people being paid because they weren't paid. And actually, it was only when one researcher looked at things a bit differently and said, hang on, why are there some people on this list who are being paid enormous amounts of money more than the other people on this list? And when they did the other research and coupled it up, it was very obvious that they were slave owners. They were being paid for the services they were providing as a contractor, almost in the same way as contract service, cleaning services in a hospital today. And that's why those people are not in that historical record. We now know that, and now that once you've seen it, you can research more and more shows up. Not as much as should, but more will show up. And I think that's one of the things to take away from this is it's always with tech history, with computing history, those stories are there and they don't detract from the existing stories by us telling them. They build on them, they add to them, they make history more interesting, steal anyone's thunder. They don't change the thing. Just because someone read something in a Ladybird book in 1987 doesn't mean that's the way things happen.
A question. Sorry. We've heard that the vector graphics was sold in the US. So it's a market overseas.
So were vector markets overseas? Yes, they absolutely were. I'm going to skip back slightly on the presentation and give a shout out to a guy. I don't know if he's watching, and I won't name him. Bear with me. That photo there is taken in the UK. It's a marketing photo for a UK distributor of vector, sent to me by the person who's in the photo. He was the young man in the photo there posing, using it at the time. They were sold here. They were licensed. I forget the name of the company that sold them out here, but they licensed them and sold them. And they were based in Windsor. Very popular machines over here with exactly the same groups of people. So accountants, lawyers, everything else, but a much smaller user base and a much smaller take up, just because there naturally was at the time. So there's weirdly some of the paperwork I've got that shows the kind of deals they did with dealers and what they would give them in marketing spreads and everything else, I've got because UK suppliers kept hold of them because they remembered having vectors and loved having vectors. And Vector would send the same info to everyone. So they send the US stuff to the UK people, as well as sending it to the US people, because it was easier than just breaking down the mailing lists. So I've got descriptions on what the US partnership plan scheme was, because they were sent to some guy in Basildon, you know, like it's that kind of thing. So yes, they were over here, nowhere near as popular over here. And actually, to be fair, they're not around long enough really to get that, because UK really is sort of 2 years behind in everything at that point. But yeah, here, Germany, Australia as well. Australia, they cause an absolute ruckus when they set up in Australia. And the reason they cause a ruckus is when the Australian branch of Vector Graphic is set up, the CEO is a woman.
Cool. That.
Yeah. And that does not go down well in Australia. And it's not, Lore Harp is a woman. The Australian CEO is a woman.
Can I also say we have a guest here, Bill Pierce, who comes from Australia, and
I joined the Australian Computer Society in 1966. and I'm still a member.
So yeah, if you joined the Australian Society in 1966, what I can tell you is some of the best graphic design I have ever seen comes on the early publications released by various Australian publications, including there's some very nice pictures of vectors on the covers of things and some very nice IBM piece. Proper like abstract kind of art things. But yeah, Vector was in Australia as well. Again, not a huge market because again, behind somewhat on the technology versus Silicon Valley. But yeah, I don't have it to hand, but if you want to know the name of the female CEO, I will happily find it for you afterwards because I'd be fascinated to know if she went on to do other things.
Well, I was in Adelaide, and they were probably in either Melbourne or Sydney.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Adelaide, yeah, you're in Adelaide and
Adelaide was early, but of course, smaller.
Yeah.
And Melbourne is 450 miles away.
Yeah, I think what you get in Australia is very much, and again, it's a whole other thing, and you'll know it better than I do, is it's really interesting how technology spreads through Australia because it spreads very differently and it spreads in all pockets. So you get Osbornes being sold in Australia a lot longer, even after the company has gone under, because actually there's still supply, still parts. Why wouldn't they sell them? And that in itself is very regional. So you actually see that happen differently in, say, as you say, Melbourne versus Adelaide versus, say, Sydney or whatever else. So yeah, but if you want, I'll dig out the name of finishes and I'll make sure it's included on whatever this goes up. It can go in the description or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I only found that out, by the way, 2 days ago when I was going back through old records again, and I found a big angry account in an Australian newspaper that not only was these American PC companies or computer companies coming over here and trying to get in there, but they're bringing their weird decadent ways of putting our CEO.
Yes.
So lovely talk. Great to look back in history at the horrible things that people did in the past. Long way back in the past. It's still happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's people in this room who can tell you whether it's happening better than I can. I think that's, yeah. I think that's. I always feel those things. Yeah, the question is it still happening? Do things still happen? And looking back on the horrible history, I think there's two things I always say is the history isn't horrible. It's just the history. And actually, as I think, hopefully, one of the things that comes from this talk is there's an awful lot to be inspired by, whatever your background. Whether the normalization of things like this is about recognizing that people can have heroes, and who your heroes are doesn't matter based on where they're from, their gender or anything like that. One of the things I get enormously angry about in a way is that growing up as a boy, probably wasn't until I kind of hit my kind of 30s that I realized I was almost allowed to have women who could be my heroes too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that culturally we collectively need to do. I think absolutely does this stuff still happen now. I would not want to speak on it. I think that's one where it's about listening to other voices around us, and also, but it is worth, and that's why with this talk I wanted to kind of cover what happened then, because I think you could very easily just do a talk on Vector and do a little bit of a hand wave and go, oh yeah, and then they failed because IBM turned up and blah, blah, blah. I think it's important to understand the context in which they operated because it does help us avoid it in future.
Very good observation. I think it's important looking at any business, and particularly technical businesses, how the people interact. I'm very impressed with Lore Harp's view of the people who make the company run are the people who put the product together.
Yeah, I mean, so
you have all the financial directors you like, but they can't put all the chips in all the boards and get them to the customers.
Yeah, so the observation in the room being that, yeah, the importance of listening to the people on that ground floor, like Harp did. She's a pioneer of that in the industry. She's not the only one who does it. I think that's important. I think there is a parallel outlet that comes through on that, and actually something I'm trying to get through in the writings on management and stuff like that. There is a trend you notice that the people who really change the world in this area are often on the CEO level. The ones who listen, and they don't just listen to their C-suite, they listen to other people. Rod Canyon is another example of that with Compaq. I was talking to Rod, I interviewed him for historical reasons, obviously, and for pieces just before Christmas. That man, as I say, effectively created the PC industry as we know it. IBM invented the PC. Canyon is the reason that from about 1986-7 onwards, they become the dominant machine, because he's the one who makes sure that the clone market, the reason we can have Dells, that we still have Dells, or over here you'd have time machines or gateways, if people remember those, all of that. That's all because he made sure that market stayed open. Compaq were the first $100 million company in their first year. And a lot of that was because he was very like Harp. You listen to the people who are on the ground. He had a policy that there were no designated parking spots at Compaq at their Texas factory, because he said if you get there first, you get a parking slot. The only one designated with a disabled slot. But if you speak to him today and say, what is the thing you are proudest of? And this is a man who arguably, as much as Estridge gave us the PC industry, and he's a $1 billion company and absolute behemoth of technology. He'll tell you that still to this day, people in Texas, in Austin, I think he lives in, will stop him on the street and say, I used to work at Compaq. It was the best place I ever worked. And you see him on the Zoom interview or anything like that, and you see his face light up when he says that. In the same way Hart's face lights up if you ask her about giving Jean that paycheck. And I do think that's a leadership lesson there, is actually the best companies are often the ones that work out how they maintain that connection and stay listening. So yes, I think it's an important management lesson to take from stuff like this.
Got a general observation here about Wikipedia and the percentage of bios that are actually about women.
I'd imagine it's a low one.
20%,
Yeah.
it's said in this note. There is actually a project to improve that situation. And apparently there's also one in French.
Yeah, so that's the project to 20% of Wikipedia bios being only that amount being about women in the project to prove it. I wish I could remember the project, because I would drop the name here.
Women in Red.
Women in Red.
Yeah.
Absolutely worth looking at. It's
Or les 100 pages.
and it's worth contributing to. And there are people in this room who will have collections of stuff. You will have your back issue magazines or things. It's worth flicking through them and looking for names, and then it's just going, actually, that's a name. I'm going to look and see if I find that somewhere else. If you find that name, go onto archive.org, stick it into an archive.org search in speech marks, and tell it to search text content, not meta content. What archive.org will then do is it will search through any books or leaflets or anything that have ever been uploaded, and you will be surprised how often you'll discover that in 1984 or 1985, that person wrote a book in which they described their entire experiences running a company or building a thing or whatever else. And even if you can't borrow it and read it from archive.org, you'll probably find that you can get a copy on Good Books or whatever else for £2 or something. I'm rarely disappointed by that.
Right, any more? Right, no, that's it. All done.
But so I can confirm for anyone not on Zoom, I will find a pub in a second and go have a pint.
Well, again, thank you so much, Gary, for such a riveting talk, and for, you've entranced us all this afternoon, and we've learned so much. And so thank you very much indeed.
Happy to do it.
I'd like to make just one or two announcements. We